Hello. I released a book a little while ago, and I thought I would give some context behind it. These are the nations of post-America. This universe starts after the economic downfall of the 20s with the beginning of the Second American Civil War defining the 2030s. To start off, the United States, founded in 1776, had a civil war, first from 1861 to 1865, and again from 2037 to 2050. Prior to the splitting of the nation, the Patriot elections of 2036 attempted to bring unity to the country by shifting each state into one party based upon a majority vote. Claims regarding election fraud in the states of Alaska, Arizona, Iowa, Missouri, Indiana, Ohio, West Virginia, and North Carolina arose, leading to the U.S. federal government investigating this claim. The Liberated States of America, founded in 2037, formed an army and occupied the investigated states of North Carolina and Missouri, since they received a majority vote to exit the Union. Immediately following that, the investigated states became occupied by the U.S. Armed Forces. The declaration of the Civil War wouldn't come until the LSA sent troops into West Virginia and Iowa in late 2037. Some time after the start of the Civil War, the LSA made a strenuous move and captured the states of New Mexico, Colorado, and Arizona in one swift offensive. However, a combination of liberal and socialist partisans agitated in Arizona. Their actions would influence revolutionaries for decades to come. Liberal and socialist unity in wartime culminated in the LSA withdrawing from the state in 2040, and the Republic of Arizona Provisional Government was formed. This would set the tone for the rest of the decade, with this period being called the Great Fracture. Later on in 2040, the socialists that had previously fought with the liberals then proceeded to revolt. They were led under a chairman who published books like The Inevitable Collapse of the United States of America. Wink, wink. A brief conflict ensued that resulted in the falling of the Republic of Arizona and the rising of the People's Republic of America in its place. War continued to rage on in the East, and from 2043 to 2045, the Western United States continued to push for independence in order to avoid being part of the Civil War. In 2044, the WUSA was ordered to march into Utah to reclaim Colorado. However, it was a failed invasion, and many lives were lost. Shortly after, years of protests for secession resulted in governmental officials in the West to leave the Union and form the Federation of California in 2045. The LSA recognized its independence and had more forces to combat the USA. Battles would continue to rage on in the East as both nations refused to surrender. Now, some years after the secession of the West, Texans would begin to fight for a libertarian government. They succeeded in 2049 and severely affected the LSA's fighting capabilities. This largely shifted the tide in the war, and the United States was able to push south in order to break a long back and forth between land. Soon, the Texan Commonwealth would ratify the concept of expansion in 2050 in order to feed their private sector. They first invaded Oklahoma, and this severely disrupted the LSA's supply line to the center of the country. This would be a defining move that changed the USA forever. At the start of the decade, both the LSA and the USA made peace, with the South giving concessions and more land to the North, despite the large amount of support the United States was giving to the Texan rebels. When Oklahoma officially came under the Texas Commonwealth, the Midwest stopped receiving support, and it would usher in a period of anarchy known as the Central Collapse of 2052. Following the collapse, the United States declared a form of manifest destiny and vowed to stabilize the anarchic land, beginning with an offensive into North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas, who for years have been militarily equipped locations with a loyalty to the liberated states, despite them no longer providing for them. The Texas Commonwealth did the same and pushed into New Mexico. Heavy resistance ensued, and new nations would form to shelter people in the chaos. A billionaire in Wyoming began a conquest to form an empire in his name and conquered land under his refined, archaic ideology. A little to the north, in Montana, Native Americans flocked to the area to create a coalition and mutually uplift one another. To the south, Texas was successful in its New Mexico campaign, despite major pushback from various groups. They then decided to intervene in America's westward reclamation, soon clashing in Kansas with the United States, while also marching into the People's Republic of America in Arizona. The chairman of the People's Republic of America decided to support separatist movements in Nevada to create a union of socialist states within America. He sent almost all of his army to the Northwest to spark a revolution, and decided to conscript a lot of soldiers, including adolescents, to defend Arizona from the Texas Commonwealth. Women soldiers began separating from the People's Republic, and soon their movement grew. While this was occurring, the billionaire in Wyoming started to construct a slave-wielding imperialistic society. After Wyoming was under his banner, he began moving south into the Colorado. The Texas invasion of Arizona and Kansas was stagnating, and the Commonwealth's corporations hoped to push into Colorado sooner. Now, after enough women had formed an army in Arizona, it became too hectic of a war zone for Texas, and they withdrew to give support in Kansas. In 2054, the female nationalists would go on to kill the Arizona chairman, and they would form an anarchist society in Arizona using the newly constructed industry from the PRA. Gopher, the chairman of the People's Republic, still had fierce loyalty within his army, and they would still push to complete the mission of bringing socialism to Nevada. To the east in Colorado, the Empire had a head start in capturing the state, but after the United States and Texas decided to split Kansas in 2055, the Commonwealth had full military capability in securing Colorado. They would clash with the Empire over this state for quite some time. In 2056, the United States was successful in occupying North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and half of Kansas. Their westward push began to look difficult, as despite knowing little about them, they had faint support of the Empire against the Texas Commonwealth. The Native American coalition had grown over the years, and they offered to give the United States a large strip of land in the north. The US took this offer, and still decided to dismantle the NAC in what is now known as Operation Link. With the indigenous collective under attack, the Empire took this opportunity to ransack the resources in what is now known as the Winter Pillage. The following year, in 2057, the US was successful in its war, and they looked towards destabilizing the West Coast after seeing the Federation of California struggle with quote-unquote Nevadan terrorists. In 2057, the United States would join the FOC's civil war and began the California coup, forcing the West Coast's army to be sent north for defense and giving the socialists a chance to proclaim the People's Republic of Nevada and push into eastern California and southeast Oregon. The Empire, still fighting Texas, decided to push west and began conquering micronations in Utah and Idaho. The US was able to reach the ocean and successfully reclaim the state of Washington. However, the government of California and Nevada decided to make a pact to repel the United States in what is now known as the Red and Green Alliance. The United States made an agreement with the Empire for the stabilized land in Idaho. They reached a multi-year agreement for arms. However, despite the USA's new battle openings, the Red and Green Alliance was able to ruin the United States' momentum and destroy the shortly lived Washington state government. Although, the pact was also shortly lived, as the Army of the People's Republic of Nevada attacked California by surprise. This could have given the United States an opportunity to counterattack, but the Westward Marching Empire met with General Gonzalez of the PRN and decided to attack California in order to aid the revolution. The Empire's efforts in the war were largely unknown, but after the war was over, US intelligence agencies discovered the truth and ceased funding for the Empire earlier than what was agreed upon. The California Civil War was a complicated battle, and it ultimately was seen as a failure in the eyes of US citizens in the East. The Nevadan Socialists worked with the California Socialists to proclaim the Democratic People's Republic of America with General Gonzalez of Nevada at the helm. The Federation of California had fallen to communists, influencing the next decade, which would become known as the Red Wave. In late 2060, the DPRA was proclaimed after the United States decided to reinforce its northern passage and exit out of the West Coast. The Empire was preparing for a war with the United States, and their militaristic society only grew more radical. In 2062, the Empire would receive funding from the DPRA in exchange for the province of Utah. This was so the Socialists could prepare for a swift invasion of Arizona and recover the original chairman's land. In 2064, the invasion of Arizona ensued, with the women, who we will call the providers, displaying heavy resistance to the behemoth socialist state before being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. This would slightly influence the Civil War of Mexico, which would spark later that same year. A multi-decade-long fracture would spread to Central America, unraveling just as ugly as the one up north. A year later, in 2065, the Socialist Republic of Mexico would be proclaimed, and they would go on to fight the Mexican government, along with other factions, for quite some time. In the same year, the empire felt prepared enough to take on the United States, and a strategic war would rage on for years. With the empire having flight capabilities, a mutual bombing campaign ensued, with an ever-expanding empire that would leave most of America in fear for what felt like forever. In the South, Mexican socialists were influential to a growing black nationalist movement in the decaying, liberated states of America. Their nation would be called the Republic of New Africa, and they would move for independence in 2065 and become successful in 2068. That same year, General Gonzalez would step down for a new chairman who would open up the nation's market and collaborate for peace between the empire and the USA a year later. When the liberated states fell in 2070, the United States marched into the South and briefly clashed with the black nationalists. With the newfound peace between the USA and the empire, the country was not eager to wage another war. The 2070s came to be known as the American Armistice. A calm before the storm is often said as well, but plenty of action occurred within this decade. The new chairman in the DPRA brought peace between the empire and the US, and later decided to divide the empire with the United States and Texas. The imperialist empire that had forced most of its population to fighting or working made the idealized quick partition into a wretched battle that showed the horrors of the totalitarian regime as soldiers moved in on their land. The leader of the empire, who had developed a cult of personality, accepted defeat and stood trial to face execution. The previous leader of the DPRA, General Gonzalez, who was the appointed general of Gopher's army, decided that there was too much corruption and collaboration with capitalists. He initially denounced the war on the empire, but later silenced his views after the global consensus was to vilify the recently carved-up nation. The general that went from the leader to the Politburo was now demoted to a congressman after being disruptful for too long in the inner circle. Years after this, he soon declared himself leader once again and created the socialist constitutional crisis. The 70s was an interesting time period, and in the future, we will discuss the individual history of each country. Now, moving on to the 2080s, despite the chaos of the socialist constitutional crisis, relations between the USA and the DPRA were decent. They had mutual trade, but the 2080 USA intervention in the Mexican Civil War led to tensions rising. The 80s could have been deemed the second red wave, but the 2086 Texas invasion of the Republic of New Africa made this decade known for the beginning of World War III. Nations across the world banded together in support of their ideology, and notably, the DPRA responded by invading Texas. The USA and the Texas Commonwealth successfully divided the Republic of New Africa in 2087, but socialist forces were able to efficiently push into Texas and US land. Soon, the US occupied the eastern territory of the failing Texas state in 2088. A long struggle in America between the USA and the DPRA ensued, and millions of lives were lost. Despite the Western world's best efforts and support from afar, they were soon obligated to occupy with full force in New England, giving a bloody push to resecure some American land in the Southwest towards Pennsylvania. In 2089, the Republic of America would be formed with a European-influenced constitution. Slowly, they would gain ground against the socialists and push them back with a large amount of the world weighing in on this conflict, with similar ones raging on from around the globe. It was an atrocious war, and calls for peace increased as time went on. Eventually, in 2091, the Democratic People's Republic of America and the Republic of America decided to have a ceasefire that is still in effect to this day. In 2100, what happens after will likely be a secret for a while, as there is so much lore to cover within the 12 major nations and unmentioned micronations that existed. To recap, the 2020s was the economic downfall, with the 2030s being the Second American Civil War. The 40s was the Great Fracture, and the 50s was the Central Collapse. The 2060s was the Red Wave, and the 2070s was the American Armistice. The 80s was World War III, and the 90s was peace. I appreciate you watching. If you enjoyed this kind of content, please let me know, because I would be more than happy to release more. Thank you.